Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us, Resolute Square, the strategy session. This is something I've been wanting to do for a long time, to interview one of my favorite strategists, I think one of the most interesting people out there in politics today, Rachel Bitecofer. And we'll give you where to follow her and all of that. But I'll just start out. If you haven't read her book, Sam, you want to put up the uh, graphic? There we are. Hit them where it hurts. How to Save Democrats by helping Republicans at their own game. It's really fascinating. I sort of watched Rachel tweet about this and sort of develop these ideas, and it's great to see it put together in one book. So, Rachel, thank you for joining us. I think people would find it really fascinating. Like, how did you end up doing what you're doing now?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great story. It's so absurd. Actually, I was watching the election returns on election night 2020. I was an advisor on Lincoln Project. Lincoln did such
Right.
great work in that cycle, kind of
I guess that's
showing.
when I first.
Yes, yeah,
Yeah.
showing Democrats like how do you actually like go out there and wedge stuff, right? Because we're so bad at it. And on election night, when we lost the down ballots, I was like, man, we can't. We're going to get hammered in this 2022 midterm if we can't even win when we have Donald Trump in office. He's killing 3,000 people a day. They're holding up the HEROES Act in the Senate. I need to go and transition from this wonky analyst pollster land that I'm in and get into the trenches of the Democrats and teach them political science. Because what's wild, Stuart, is I am modernizing electioneering strategy using findings from political science, one of which goes back to 1950s, which is that the electorate knows absolutely fucking nothing about politics. It knows who the president is. It might be able to tell you who the vice president is. Maybe sometimes if they've been in office a while, they're governor, but they're not going to know they're a member of the House. They certainly aren't going to be able to have a conversation with you about a motion to vacate, okay? Like the electorate knows nothing. And the other thing is that because the electorate knows nothing, it is incredibly reliant on the party label. The party label dictates, explains, I don't need to know anything else about you, man, woman, all these demos you hear about. All I need to know is, are you a Republican or do you lean that way? Are you a Democrat or do you lean that way? And I can predict 95% of the time who you're going to vote for a year out from the election. So we had not kind of internalized those things. I think the other thing too, and I'm just so honored to have you compliment me because I'm such a huge fan of you and your work, 5 presidential campaigns, right? So it's not, you know what you're talking about. And so when you read this book, you probably thought, wow, I learned a lot of it watching you guys, how you do it. I used to teach my course in political behavior and campaigns and elections with a focus on strategy. And I would show them like, look, you got 2 parties, but they do not electioneer the same way. And Democrats are electioneering to an electorate that only exists in their mind. And
Talk about that. How would you lay out the differences, Rachel, of the different
Sure.
approaches?
Yeah. I mean, this really evolves. I think there's a lot of background in it, but people need to understand that the electorate's constantly in motion, and what we call in political science is dealignment and realignment. Okay. So we are in a moment that is like the end of a 50-year dealignment, realignment project. There's still some happening, but most of it has changed. And where you can find that is the Democratic Party was at one time a party of rural people, right? And its power base was in the South. And now it's a party of, city and suburban people, and its power bases in the Northeast and the West Coast, right? And, over time, like as this process was happening, certain techniques evolved to do electioneering. And I think both parties were kind of into this idea that, you've got Clinton Republicans and whatever, and you want to pull them over, right? And so you minimize partisanship and you're trying to pull in conservative Democrats and liberal Republicans to like flip over. Well, over time, those people, like they finish their motion and they're squarely in one party or the other. And Republicans with Karl Rove, I mean, Karl Rove is so evil, but I've always admired the strategic mind that he introduced into presidential politics, because what he's decided in 2024 was, okay, what's the one asset John Kerry has? This is a war election, very atypical. Almost always it's the economy, but this time it was national defense because of the Iraq War. And John Kerry's big strength, of course, was his military history, especially Bush had not gone into the military. So they found that strength. And instead of doing persuasion as in like we do it, which, hey, vote for us, we're going to get you a homeowner's, first time buyer's tax credit. They're like, hey, John Kerry's a liar who stole his valor. Don't vote for John Kerry, because there's only two choices. Okay. And political behavior is conclusive for decades that even if you give people other choices, they're going to pick one of these two choices. So it was about moving the party off of that old persuasion model, persuasion by selling a product, to new persuasion that Republicans go on and perfect by that 2010 shellacking that Michael Steele and the RNC helped deliver, the fire Pelosi strategy, right? Where you really start to see at that point the full nationalization of down ballot races, where everybody was tied to Obama, Obamacare, and Pelosi, and it had such returns on investment for you guys, or for the Republicans. So like that's what I was watching, and I wanted to understand too, Stuart. Like I was starting my academic career at Georgia. It was my first year of my PhD program, and to see Republicans pick up 63 seats in the House that cycle is so stupendous, because people forget the context. The context was a year prior, the entire economy collapsed, and people were having real honest conversations about whether Republicans could even ever gain the House again, like in decades, because of what had happened post New Deal, post Great Depression. And within a year, they picked up 63 seats in the House. Why? Because they innovated. They figured out how to do persuasion by disqualification. They began a branding operation that's been incredibly effective, especially in terms of the word socialist. So 15 years now of high up people, not, Rush Limbaugh on the radio, but politicians like Paul Ryan and John Boehner and Eric Cantor and so on and so forth, branding Democrats as extremist. And so what we ended up with as we came into this Trump era was one party that was full of moderates branded as extremists, and another party that was increasingly full of extremists with a reputation of moderation. And that's what I am working on now to fix, to bring average people up to speed on what's happened.
As someone who was part of the 2004 campaign, and I don't think Carl is evil, but he is a genius. And I've said that I think in all the years I worked in politics, there are two people I worked with who I would consider geniuses. And one is Karl Rove and the other is Rick Wilson.
Oh, cool.
And they have very interesting similarities. We could do a whole show about that. One of which, they are both obsessive readers. And they both are very good listeners, it's part of their autodidacts. I mean, Carl never graduated from college. Rick is someone who never stopped learning. He was like a philosophy major in college. But the origins of that strategy in 2004, we would make these spots, like particularly about Afghanistan and women voting, that sort of thing. And we would show them in focus groups, and literally people would cry. They'd say, that's the best ad I've ever seen. And then they'd sort of pause a minute, but I'm never going to vote for the bastard. Never. And it was that if you weren't going to vote for George Bush, there was nothing we could tell you to get you to vote for George Bush. One of the Bush policy goals, which to some degree they achieved, which I think probably in retrospect was a deep mistake, was trying to raise the level at which you don't pay federal income tax. The whole idea was, family of four, you make $40,000 a year, you won't pay any income tax. So we would sit in rooms with people who no longer were paying income tax, federal income tax, due to legislation that Bush had pushed through. And we'd ask them if Bush had raised their taxes, and they would go, yeah, absolutely. And then you would point out to them, well, you don't pay any federal taxes anymore. And they still were like, my taxes are going up. They wouldn't believe you. I mean, even if you just
Yes.
So we fell back on what became known as fortress precincts, which was where Bush got, say, 60% in the precinct. The goal became try to get 62, 63. And that was basically it. But I know there's some sort of talk about what a brilliant strategy it was. But it really was the only strategy. I mean, if you were sitting in this room and going through this, it was the only path. And I can remember vividly talking to the president about it with Carl, and he was saying, well, guys, is this going to work? And our honest answer was, we have no idea. But it's the only thing that could work. Yes. And, Bush could be a very good candidate in that sense. Wherever he would go, he'd get off, Marine One or Air Force One, and he'd say, there's a lot of people out there, they hate us. We ought to kill them before they kill us. And then he would get back on the plane. Whereas Kerry was running, he really tried to surf news cycles. I remember at one point in 2004, there was a flu vaccine shortage. And he spent time talking about the flu vaccine, where like people were bringing syringes to rallies. And it was like, this is weird.
Flip-flops, remember the flip-flops?
Yeah, I don't think this race is going to be about it's bad that there's a flu vaccine. So he was basically trying to blame Bush for anything negative in the news.
Right.
But look, it almost worked. One thing I'll say about Bush world, we were never arrogant. We never thought we had it figured out. If half the crowd at a home game at Ohio State had changed votes, Kerry would have won.
Yep.
So, and it was, the last time we won the popular vote.
You just kind of stumbled on such an important point, right? Like, you did all this work, you have these ads, they resonate, they test well, right? Like, people respond to them, but they don't change the vote, right? No. And there's one thing that will change the vote, and that is, it turns out, shitting on the other product and not even really talking about your own, right?
Yeah. This is the evil of focus groups. And I think how focus groups have I think they hurt the Democratic Party initially more than they hurt the Republican Party, because in the Republican Party, there was this tendency to ignore focus groups. The first presidential campaign I sort of lightly touched was the 88 campaign for Bush. Okay. And I made a film for the convention. They ended up not using it. But I can remember being in Bush headquarters, and there was a media division of that, kind of a thing. And I thought this was very cool. I'd never been in a presidential headquarters before, And there was a big gun safe in their media room. And I was like, what's that? He goes, that's where Roger, meaning Roger Ailes, puts all our spots and locks them up so that Bob Teeter, the pollster, can't test them. And it was absolutely true, because it was based on, Ailes said, we're not going to test stuff. And Bob had people come in and get the actual, because then you actually had videotape to test him. So he literally would lock him up. But I think that when you put people in focus groups, and it's such an unnatural environment, and you're asking them questions. It's like I see these polls that say people want to know more about Vice President Harris. Well, who's going to say, no, I don't want to know more?
No doubt.
That's just like a dumb answer. I know everything I need to know.
No doubt, Stuart. And who's going to ask the next logical question, which is, have you ever bothered to Google her website, right? Because I guarantee you the answer would be 100% no. I don't know what she stands for, and I refuse to take any kind of corrective step to, you know what I mean? So, yeah.
In the Lincoln Project in 20, well, still today, but we never tested anything. And, people, when I started working with the Lincoln Project, one of the things that really hit me was how liberating it was not to have a client.
Yes.
Because we could get up in the morning, decide we want to make, Rick and I go make them, and we could just put them up. And we didn't have to run them by candidate or committee.
And have them ruined. They're ruined too when they do that, because the only people that know is you and me and Rick, right? They don't know.
And whatever we did, we're in a very enviable position that no one was going to go to Joe Biden and say, how did you let these lunatics put up a billboard in Times Square accusing Barrett and Ivanka of murder? He wasn't going to be held responsible for it.
Yeah.
But so, look, So focusing just on where we are now, how do you think, describe to us how you think the Harris-Walz campaign is framing it versus Trump, and kind of what your grades of both are? Who do you
Oh, I
think?
mean, the Harris campaign is everything I could have ever hoped to have seen emerge by 2024, right? I mean, and the switch was everything, and I knew she was a great candidate, but she's even better than I could have thought. My mother loves her, and my mother is a lifelong Reagan Republican. It took a lot to get her off the Republican brand, right? Now she's buying friendship bracelets because Kamala owned Donald Trump and made him her little bitch on that debate stage, and it totally won my mom over. I can't complain about the Harris campaign. My focus.
Stop there for a second. So what is it that they're doing that you particularly like? You think that they grasp the sense of contrast?
Yes. And some of it, is conditional on the switch timing. So normally, like the positive stuff, my rule is if I have $1 million, I'm spending 80% of it defining my opponent as an extremist. That's a threat to you, not to other people, to you, right? But like with Kamala, because of the switch and the timing and the need, like it is actually makes sense to have some of this like positive, biographical, fleshing out of the candidate. You needed to do that in this situation. Where I think that they have done brilliantly is that they're making it a referendum on Trump, right?
Yeah.
And that's what we needed to do. Like that, where I got the ideas is from watching you guys, is teaching you guys. But like one of the things that really taught me it was this race in Massachusetts in the 80s. Like that was going really bad for Republicans. And so they found like this thing about the Democratic incumbent and just napalmed him over it, right? And they ended up flipping that seat. And that's when I like started to connect, if you can pop into a referendum and win the referendum argument, right? So your napalm has, if there's no napalm on the other side, you win. And that's where Democrats have been for a long time. Right? But like if you match napalm on counter offense, not on responding to their lobs, but your own favorable territory, like for us, it's abortion, obviously, in Project 2025, then you can really destabilize people, especially people who aren't used to being on defense. And so to answer your question in contrast, you've got Harris really pounding Trump. I mean, just charisma oozing out of reporters and no time. They don't have 9 Benghazi hearings to define her, right? They have no time. And the problems that Biden faced with like getting people to know his record, because no one watches the news. No one's like us. We are information freaks. Nobody is like us. The Biden team's like, oh my God, they spent like $300 million trying to get people to know about the CHIPS Act, right? Never made any progress. That's what Republicans are facing now, trying to define Kamala Harris. And when you combine that with the ineptness, because you have a candidate that is not a strategic player, Donald Trump he's always been a non-strategic actor. He's so out of control in his own mind. He does not behave in ways like you and I would, where we're maximizing the probability of winning. He's just, emotional, emotional 2-year-old. It just all comes out wherever, right? And so they're in a really bad spot because what they need in this moment, especially, is a very good candidate. And they were going to squeak by because apparently, you can be frustrated about it. It shouldn't matter that Joe Biden was old when the other guy is a 91 indicted, insurrectionist, right? But our civic culture is sick, Stuart. And if we get through this democratic crisis, that's what I want to work on. Like we have to fix our civic crisis. We have such a literate population. How can you have a government for the people, by the people, if the people don't vote? 50% of them don't even vote. And in that 50% that do, many of them cannot articulate any detail about the government that oversees them. If you asked America to name a famous judge, it wouldn't be Thomas, guys. It would be Judge Judy. That's the electorate that we have. And we have to get real about it because we're in this crisis moment for a lot of reasons. It's the end of white hegemony, the rise of females, a lot of cultural pressure and generational stuff is coming together at once. But ultimately, because of digital tech and the ability to distribute propaganda, we have to make it our mission focus after this election to start dealing with our political culture. And unfortunately, that's generational work that's going to have to start. And maybe you and I won't even see the end of.
This lack of understanding, there's certain moments that people really drive home. I was at one of the early Tea Party rallies in Ohio, which was really the birthplace and there were people with signs that said, "Take your government hands off my Medicare." It's like, yes. I don't know. We have to talk about this. But, this point that you made about how do you control an agenda of a race? Just because the other side wants to talk about an issue and just because the other side attacks you on it doesn't mean that you have to respond in a defense or on that subject at all.
Right.
And I'll give you a classic example. I was working for this guy, Bob Ehrlich. He was running for governor of Maryland. They hadn't elected a Republican governor of Maryland since Agnew. And Agnew didn't exactly help the brand. And it was a time, if you remember that bizarre, horrible sniper shootings that were happening in Washington. Yes. It was terrifying. Mm-hmm. And Bob had been in Congress and, had voted pretty good rating from the NRA. So Democrats were attacking him on gun control because it made sense in some sense because people were afraid to get gas because they're going to get shot, We never really responded to it. And we attacked on traffic. Mm-hmm. And we thought that was something that would resonate more with people. And we were right because people, traffic was such a mess in Washington. There was these, in that, greater Baltimore, Washington area. And there was talk about building these different highways. And, we said, no, it's not a race about that. And he ended up getting elected, the first Republican. I used to tell candidates that there's just two things the candidates can always control: what you say and where you spend money. Mm-hmm. And that's really the truth of it. And I think that I wonder, how much of Harris's background as a prosecutor is helping her here. A lot. She's able to go out and make this case against Trump. To me, that she does this in a very compelling fashion, and she has that ability to do it and still like her.
Yes, with a smile, right? Yeah, it's really bless your heart. She's kind of perfected the bless your heart attack, right? Yeah, right. She's cutting it, and Whitmer's really good at this as well. Cutting you with a knife, but looking pretty and smiling while you do it,
So let me ask you two questions here. What is the scenario for Trump to win? What would have to happen for Trump to win, do you think, in the next, 5 weeks?
Yeah, great. I mean, that gives me a chance to shameless plug the cycle on Substack where I do election analysis. That's next level. It's not 538 boring stuff. Okay. I'm a political scientist. I'm telling you that stuff is boring. Come read my stuff. And last week I profiled the Achilles heel of the Republican Party, which is the dismantling of the RNC's field operation. You'll know better than anyone how catastrophic that was going to be, And I quote Rick in it. I said, as Rick says, everything Trump touches dies. So when the RNC was turned into the TNC, I knew it was going to have a massive impact on field. And of course, what did they do? They purged all those people out. They've got rid of all the professionals, and then they outsourced it to a grifter, Charlie Kirk, and they to Elon Musk's super PAC, right? So next week, though, I do the Achilles heel of the Democrats, and what that is this. In 16, he brought in Brad Parsell. Okay, Brad Parsell sold cars and made a website for him, but got strategy at a high level. And unlike the Democratic Party, which I've been trying to crawl my way to for years now, when there's talent on the Republican side, I mean, the first people who ever called me was never Trump, right? Come on in, So Parsell ends up running this digital operation in 2016 on Facebook that ended up having a very big impact. And this time around, what they've been doing, I mean, they've been building this infrastructure for years now, so it's not even new, is really taking advantage of digital tech to get in and target young men and radicalize them, right? Yeah. And so, like, it's hard to say, like, if you wanted me to put odds on it, I feel it's a 75 Harris race at this point, and it will never change going through, right? The question is that can she get to like +5 on that aggregate, and then and we'll start to feel more comfortable about those electoral college stuff. But the known unknown is going to be how effective was it, this multi-million-dollar digital psych op that they've been running for years now on men, and can it bring in new voters for them too? So that's, to me, the one unknown factor. And then, of course, I want people to appreciate, because it's hard sometimes we get bogged down in what's to come. Like, let's look back at where we've been. We moved enough strategy in 2022 to disrupt their midterm effect. That's almost never happens. Right. And that's why I devoted my life to doing, right? And we got to beat this midterm effect. And because it was done in some races, like Whitmer ran the best campaign. It was pure negative partisanship strategy. By September, Tudor Dixon was a political corpse, okay? And how she did it, defining her as an extremist on abortion, one issue. She didn't focus on how great her record was and what she's done. She just focused on Tudor Dixon and branding her as an extremist and tapping into that abortion initiative, right? And because of that, we have the blue wall. Democratic people who believe in democracy control those blue wall states. The Republican Party, however, does have Georgia. And, I worry. I don't know how you can be watching, especially Mike Johnson today. Well, yeah, of course, if it's a free and fair election, we're going to certify it. And that it carries so much weight, Stuart. And I know you and I were both watching and talking publicly about the plain sight efforts that way preceded election day in 2020, right? Mm-hmm. And we're watching the big lie 2.0 get seeded. What is it? It's that we brought in 6 million illegals. We sent them all across the country, even though they're the ones that did it. And now we're going to register them to vote. And when they lose, that's what the argument's going to be, right? And so, if it was just a normal election, I'd be feeling pretty good. Where I worry is the Senate. And the reason is because I wanted all the House and all the Senate campaigns to do what you guys did in 2010, centralize one negative partisanship strategy message and pound all your Republicans from the state ledge to the House to the Senate with it, right? And I haven't achieved that kind of influence yet, right? And where it matters is look at JD Vance, okay? JD Vance, as soon as he's tapped for VP and into the spotlight of the best campaign in this country's history, the Harris campaign, they pull out all this footage of him and just napalm him, okay? And keep in mind, this man ran in 2022 and the Ohio electorate saw none of that. And why? Because Tim Ryan's, you can only, by the way, candidates take the advice of consultants, right? Like you and me, right? Candidates can only do what their advisors are suggesting to do. So if they're being advised to do the wrong shit, they're going to follow that. And Tim Ryan certainly was a great example of that. I mean, millions of people cast ballots, the swing bucket in Ohio, and they never knew that JD Vance is an extremist that says terrible things about women. If I am convinced that if Tim Ryan had run that strategy, he'd be sitting in the Senate right now.
Well, I mean, Vance underperformed top of the ticket, by 400,000 votes? Mm-hmm. I mean, that's almost unheard of.
Yeah.
That to have that kind of, which shows that tremendous vulnerability. One of the things that's always fascinated me, Rachel, is politics is a business that is recession-proof and that we spend more money on every cycle. And we spend billions and billions of dollars on advertising. So here we have, in our non-political world, these brilliant minds in advertising. I mean, the people who are doing Apple and Nike. And none of those people have ever been able to break into the political world. And they have tried before. And it's always kind of fascinating me. So why is that? And, I was asked some years ago by Ad Age, to design a campaign for McDonald's for Burger King against McDonald's. As it is simple. Eat McDonald's, it kills you. Buy Burger King.
Yes. You're my kind of man.
Like, well, we can't do that. They're like, why? You could do it. But it's like the sense that they would say that it is bad for the business, that it's bad. You want people to eat more hamburgers. So if you say, okay, if you go to McDonald's and poison you, that's ultimately going to be bad for your. I don't believe that actually, but anyway,
it's constantly us assigning more cognition capability to consumers, whatever, than they have by far. Yeah.
But contrast has always worked better. You have to make it this choice.
Yes. While we're on the topic, Stuart, just saying, like I now that I'm a quasi ad man, occasionally I get to design ads, I have to say, like, I've gotten really into the idea of commercials, like out of the political world and what we could do with like the terrible knowledge of human psychology and behavior that I have in my brain in terms of selling stuff. And it kind of makes me wonder like how bad they are, because I see stuff all the time. Like one of the things I'm trying to get liberals to understand is that nobody gives a shit about out groups except for us. Like we are the freakiest people that we care about Haitian immigrants. Okay. Like most people do not care. And yet, so we make ads. What I always said is we make ads by liberals for liberals with these collective like appeals, right? Where really what would work better is individualized, personalized loss aversion with people, right? Mm-hmm. People care, they don't care what's going to happen to pregnant women in the South, or especially not people of a different race, right? If you want to win the election in the burbs, you go with the best weapon you have. That weapon is, hey, white women of the burbs, look at these women being tortured by these abortion bans. It could be you or your daughter. Don't try to get them to care about others, because that's just not how human beings are.
Yeah, we always found people were willing to believe that a politician could stop bad things from happening to you more readily than they would believe the politician will do good things for you. Like it's much easier to convince somebody, vote for this person, they will stop taxes from going up. And vote for this person, they will cut your taxes. If you look at these Republican governors who get elected in blue states, and most of them are clients of mine, Hogan, Charlie Baker, just Scott in Vermont.
Yeah.
That was always the way they approach it. We'll stop taxes from going up. We'll try to do that. And people would find that credible versus like promising that you're going to cut their taxes. It seems to me that the ability now that Democrats have to determine what the agenda is going to be is something that the media has just doesn't understand. I mean, it's like in 22, everybody said it's going to be about the economy. It's going to be about inflation. It's, no, it doesn't have to be. Campaigns are what you make them. I mean, there wasn't a poll in 2007 I remember seeing that hope and change was the number one issue in the country. Right, and the Obama campaign made it an issue. It wasn't like,
you set the narrative or you lose, I gotta tell you, man.
I really.
What's been amazing is like, okay, so in the book I talk about CRT and how they defined Virginia's entire general election in 2021 around an issue that didn't even exist, and then number one, it's not even real, right? Let alone it wasn't on the radar. And then by 11 months later, it's the number one issue. And how? Well, centralized messaging, all the Republican state legislative candidates in the state, all three of the statewides. And, with Glenn, they're like, it's not like Glenn Youngkin gives a shit about public education, guys. Like he's a tax business. That's his background. And in our party, we'd be like, oh, Glenn, your strength is business and economy. Let's run you on business and economy, right? And like in the Republican Party, they show up and they're like, look, we get that, but voters are just not that into you. And we think if we can wedge race and education, make white people feel like they're being targeted, we can win, right? And everyone gets on board because it doesn't matter how you won the power, you can use it for anything. So you run on the most optimal thing. But I will say we have succeeded in making Project 2025 a narrative setting household name, right? And that work began like a year ago, right? And it's just amazing to see like the evolution in the data because like, when that operation first started, it's okay, like let's get the grassroots excited about this. And then as they're talking about it, we can get the political leadership involved. And once you have the Biden campaign name dropping Project 2025, the media is going to cover it more, right? And so we're really in a situation where we started with like 5% of people who knew what Project 2025 is. All right. And they didn't even know anything to have an opinion. Now it's, I would still say probably 50% in that swing bucket pool in Pennsylvania and Michigan, wherever, probably 50% have heard Project 2025. The good news is all they needed to know was the thing I always said, let's just try this branding stuff. I think it will work. They know this. Trump equals Project 2025 and Project 2025 equals bad. Okay. And that's ultimately all we had to accomplish. So, I just wish that all the Senate races were pounding this way. It's hard to get incumbents who have gotten reelected and elected on one model to embrace a wholly new experiment. But there's still time, Montana.
Incumbents, having worked for a lot of, they have this very human desire to talk about what they've done.
Right.
And they know it was difficult because usually passing legislation is difficult.
Yes.
And, you have to sit in these rooms with them and find a way where they'll listen to you and say, you have to understand no one gives a shit about what you've done.
Exactly.
First of all, this piece of legislation, fine, but like, the law of the sea treaty is not going to be what this race is about. You have to talk about the future. It's very difficult to get them away from that. And I think the worst is because, it's like they all put on togas when they went over there or something, and you only have to run every 6 years. So you really forget how to be a candidate.
Yeah. And, I get it too, like why people like Democrats, we're just ethical and fair and database and logic, right? Like, and that's all fine and dandy, right? But at the end of the day, you're in the war. You don't get a choice. Like you are in a rhetorical war that will determine whether we have a constitutional democracy with rule of law or not. And if you can't just opt out, like I wish we could just will them into normalcy. We tried it for 10 years and all it got us was to the brink, right? So now we're at the very brink of democratic collapse. And so, I tell Democrats, I'm like, man, what's going to be really uncomfortable? Calling your Republican opponent an extremist and focusing on them and not yourself and your ads might make you feel a little bad. But what's going to make you feel really bad is next year when you're trying to decide whether you should hide a 6-year-old dreamer who's never been to Guatemala in your attic because the Trump mob is coming for them, right? That's going to be uncomfortable. So like all I'm asking you to do, I'm not asking you to lie. We're not like them. We don't have to make shit up. We just have to bring these tuned out people up to date on what has happened to the Republican Party, your beautiful Republican Party, which is dead. Okay, that party is dead and gone. There's a new thing, and it is very, very dangerous.
Well, look, on that positive note, which I couldn't agree with more, I don't think the Republican Party is a normal political party in any sort of American mainstream. I think it's become an extremist movement, and it's acting like an extremist movement more than it is a traditional political party. And part of extremist movements is there's always an increased level of a purity test.
Yes.
Last year when it wasn't good enough, then you have to do it. And you saw DeSantis trying to run to the right of Trump.
Mm-hmm.
They have to just burn themselves out. It wasn't the moderate element of the Red Guard that finally got the Red Guard to
right.
quit putting people in dunce hats and sending them to labor camps. It wasn't the moderates in the Khmer Rouge that finally
exactly
triumphant in the movement.
Yeah.
And I think that it's just extraordinarily dangerous what has happened, and it is
Yeah,
so difficult for people to accept that.
it is.
You know,
It's a built-in bias that we have towards optimism. I have
and
convinced that
we,
that's the issue.
whenever someone is saying something that sounds kind of crazy, and we always assume that they will change. That we even have language for it. They said they'll revert to normalcy.
Yeah, right.
But like with Trump, this is normal for him.
Yes.
He's not going to change. And there
No,
is no party to go back to.
there isn't. I mean, there was two rule of law, pro-democracy Republicans left, and they were named Liz Cheney and
Yeah.
Adam Kinzinger. Okay. And they were purged, both of them, for the sin of refusing to join the cult. Right. And, you know, what I would tell people is this: yes, there's extremism on the left, and the right has always done a good job of elevating it, right? And it's nutty stuff. But when you look at the power structure of the Democratic Party, extremists have no power. There's a very small caucus
100%.
of extremists. They
100%.
don't committee chair. They aren't running the party. They sure as hell aren't our presidential nominee, right?
It's Nancy Pelosi who's going to Taiwan.
No doubt, right?
You know,
I mean, this is a
it's
centrist party, and it might be easier. I'm just going to make this final appeal because I know your audience. It might be easier to come over here and help us build the most, powerful centrist party in the history of this country so that we can get shit done, right? Yeah. A party that is not radical. And, when the nice thing about what happened with you guys is that it taught us in time how to stop that from happening to us, right? So it may not be the best asset, especially if you're a lifelong Republican, but the one thing we do have is a sane political party that is sitting right there ready for you to come join it.
There's one pro-democracy party in America. It's the Democratic Party.
Right.
I mean, it's just couldn't be more obvious.
It couldn't be.
Well, look, right. Tell people how to find you on Twitter. I read you all the time. What's your Twitter handle?
So it's just my name, first and last. There's no other Bitecofers because nobody would want that monstrosity. So it's Rachel Bitecofer. I have the book. The book, guys, I'll tell you, Jamie Harrison is a huge fan of the book. He bought 3 copies for all the state party leaders. This book is really, really having an impact on how people think about politics because it's getting you to know what I know, which is that the electorate is the opposite of informed and engaged. Okay. It's the opposite. And once you accept the fact that most women walking into these abortion clinics are finding out for the very first, or into the hospital because they have a miscarriage, or finding out for the very first time that abortion's been banned. They didn't even know, guys. So we have to be the information source to tell them. And this book will teach you not only why we need to do that, but how to do it.
And your Substack, how often are you writing on your Substack now?
Yeah, so I kind of left it on a slow boil for a long time when I was trying to focus on strategic work. And you and I both know strategy happens before tactics, right? So it's I'm pretty much done my work in 24, right? So now I've really focused back in and I'm publishing once a week. I am doing election analysis that teaches you the fundamentals of political science. You don't see I can promise you guys the probability of a Harris or Trump victory is not swinging 20%, 15% in a week when there hasn't even been an event. Okay. So I'm not going to sell you crack. I'm going to sell you real solid information. And it's not going to be, yes, I'm coming from a partisan place. I am a Democrat, really focused on electing Democrats. But the thing that I care even more about that is being right and beating the boys, the election nerd boys. So you can trust this information is coming from an unbiased place in my brain.
Well, listen, thanks for joining us. You have to come back. Promise you'll come back.
I would love to.
We'll talk more about it. And thanks to everybody out there if you haven't subscribed to Resolute Square, we're doing everything we can to be an alternative to big corporate media and the crazy right-wing media stream. And I think if no one's going to save us, we have to do it ourselves. So subscribe to Resolute Square. Listen to Rick Wilson's The Enemies List podcast and Joe Trippy's That Trippy Show podcast. And thanks so much, and we'll see you next Tuesday.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Rachel. Really appreciate it.
Ah, love you.